Hey everybody, how's everybody doing today? I'm still arranging stuff, getting ready for today's stream. Sorry. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. It's good to see everyone. Let me just check in, see who's here today. We have Leon, first one in. Awesome. Hi Marcia from Florida. Awesome. And Seraphin's in Orlando. And Michael, good to see you from Thailand. Plato, always good to see you. Scott Mumford, Jonas, Janet. Oh my goodness, everybody's here. And wow, another one in Florida. God, that's awesome. I got to go to Florida sometime. Maybe. What do I got this weekend? Oh, I got stuff this weekend. I guess I won't go this weekend. But my family's in going to be in Orlando this weekend. I thought I might try to join them, but I scheduled stuff, so I can't go. What else is going on? Yeah, fashionably late, I know. And I see a question here. Oh my goodness. Ben is here from Narrowband Channel. That's awesome. And he's from Pennsylvania. We need to get together soon. And Scott has a question about the 17 millimeter f1.8. Saying the country of origin is Vietnam. No, I wouldn't worry about it. Olympus makes the factories over there, I guess at the time. I think they moved from China to Vietnam. Well, whatever the case, I wouldn't worry about it. There's always sample variations in the lenses. Some people say that it's not as sharp as others of the same make and model and everything. But generally speaking, if you buy it brand new and you have any issues, you can always have it exchanged or repaired via warranty. I mean, not that that's comforting, right? Who wants to do that? But I would say, like, if you have another lens that you know is tack sharp at a certain aperture, test 17 millimeter at the same aperture and see if it's any better or any worse than a lens you already have. And if it's better, that's great. If it's worse, there could be a problem, right? I did a review on the 17 f1.8 where I think I kind of did that, and I showed the sharpness at various apertures, wide open to like f5.6. And I know wide open, if I remember correctly, it was about the same as a kit lens, wide open, if not a little bit worse. And then as soon as you stop it down, it just surpassed the kit lens by far, in my case. And hopefully, you have a kit lens you can kind of compare it to. So compare f3.5 on your kit lens versus, say, f1.8 on the 17, and see if that's in line with what I did in my video, because I think that's what I did in my video. So if you search for my video on the 17 millimeter, that'll give you a baseline of comparison when you eventually do get the lens compared to mine. And I'm very, very happy with mine, and I don't think it really could be any better. So I got lucky. Now, the only thing with the 17, I bought mine used for like $250 at the time. And I noticed in video mode, the lens kind of clickety clacks a little bit. One of the motors, in focusing motor or the aperture, well, it's probably the focusing motor. It's not loud, right? Like if I was outside, I probably wouldn't be able to hear it. But in my room here, and I start to focus with it in video mode, I do hear the focusing motors, and that can get picked up by the internal mics on your camera. So, like I said, outdoors, it's not going to be an issue. But if you're in a very quiet environment and you're just using the camera's internal mics, you might hear that sound. And I heard that that's not normal. It shouldn't do that. And by definition, being an MSC movie still compatible lens, it should not do that by definition. So mine might have a defect. So check for that as well. Go into movie mode and listen to the lens and see if it gets picked up by the internal mics in a quiet environment when you're in movie mode and continuous autofocus. Those are the two things I would check for. Compare it against your kit lenses wide open, and compare it against and check the continuous autofocus in movie mode. And if those two things check out, I think you'll be perfectly fine. You got a good copy. Now, I don't think bad copies are prevalent. It's probably the exception more than the rule, but it is out there. Um, it's the most common thing I've heard about that lens in terms of getting one. And I don't think it's any better or worse than quirks you find in any kind of gear, really. So that's all I can tell you about that. And let's see, let me hide this one. But I would definitely get it either way. And odds are you'll be perfectly fine. Oh, let's see. Oh, John Follows is here. Good to see you. Yeah, well, Leon confirmed it. Yeah, they moved the factory out of China to Vietnam. Yeah, I remember they did that just a few years ago, like recently, like on their 100th year anniversary. I think they were completely transitioned, which was maybe a year or two ago. So it's going to be state of the art, whatever they have over there. Wow, am I on? Oh yeah, okay. I just make sure. I'm just catching up on the chat. There's a lot of chatter about me being late again. Gigafish, how are you? Says I'm curious what this topic goes to. I don't even know what spot high, spot low is. Okay, yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. I just wanted to catch up first because normally I don't do topics for my live streams. I just kind of sit down, turn on the camera, and we just jibber jabber about whatever comes to mind, right? And it's actually Rick Bear suggested I do this topic because spot metering is really really handy. Now I have to say that in practice, like all of the fancy features our cameras have, I rarely use myself, even though I've done all these videos like live composite, live bulb, high res shot mode, the live ND. What else do we got? We got starry sky. I mean, um, we have all kinds of features in our cameras, and I don't use them too much myself, except for spot metering. I do use that one. Uh, I would say 10 to 20% of my photography I do, well, probably closer to 10, which is a lot, right? And everything else combined might even only be 1 or 2% of my photography. But spot metering, I would say, is about 10% of my normal photography, street photography, and spot metering in my professional photography, when I do my commercial real estate and architectural, I would say is like 100%. I use spot metering. It's very, very important uh, in professional work, the work that I do anyway. So I wanted to sort of go over it again. I do have a video on spot high and spot low that I did about a year ago, but I left out a couple of things that I'm going to try and cover today as well about spot metering. But it's a really good video on spot metering. So if you search my channel, is around July of last year, I did a video on spot metering, spot high, spot low, and I explained that along with the histogram. So I'll give you a little bit of a condensed version of that today, and then the couple things I've sort of left out when I made that video, because again, it's not something I use a lot myself in regular photography, only in my professional work. And in my professional work, I use it in the most simplistic way. I spot meter one section, and then I adjust the ambient. I get the ambient light with the spot meter through a window, for example, because it's very very bright compared to the inside. So let me set up the scene. I'm in a living room, and it has a big bay window out the backyard, and it's a bright day outside. the light coming in through the window is going to be much, much brighter than coming inside to the house. And into the living room, especially if the living room has dark furniture, there's a huge dynamic range there. So I spot meter for the window so I get that exposure correct. And then I use flash to adjust the brightness of the interior of the room so that everything blends together nicely. And in regular photography, you can apply these same principles, in your day-to-day stuff, which, like I said, about 10% of the time I'll do that when I encounter a very high dynamic range scene. I like to make sure that the area that I want to be exposed properly, assuming I can't bracket or I don't have time to bracket, assuming, because bracketing will bring everything in, then you can merge them back and get everything in correct exposure. But spot metering can really help you get the exposure that you want, without things getting clipped too dark or clipped too bright. Clipped meaning all the details gone. There's nothing left in the highlights, like the clouds are completely white. There's no textures or tones in the clouds. And vice versa, you're taking a picture at sunset and the landscape is completely crushed to black almost because the sun is so bright. And you got the clouds and everything correct, but then the texture in the landscape is all blacked out. So spot metering kind of helps you balance that difference between the two, because you can kind of measure the exposure between the two spots before you take the picture and then dial in some exposure comp. Now that said, exposure comp, well, I'm sorry. Apparently Alexa thinks I was talking to her and is now spouting out some random information. Sorry. Anyhow, we now have, with our mirrorless cameras, we have the highlight shadow indicators, right? Things will be red and that are blowing out highlights, and things will turn blue in the viewfinder or live view that are clipped, near black. And that's generally a pretty reliable way to measure your highlights and shadows without having to spot meter. And then you can dial exposure comp and adjust the exposure to what you think is appropriate. But that is actually nowhere near as reliable as spot metering, because spot metering measures the exposure directly off the sensor versus the highlight and shadow clipping. Okay, that method is measuring the values off a JPEG value. In theory, it is directly off the sensor, but it's not as accurate. And I'll demonstrate when that doesn't work. It doesn't work, especially in low light. And it doesn't work too well in particularly bright light. It's not as reliable, but much better. So I would say I shouldn't even bring it up. In very bright light, extreme circumstances, the clipping indicator is pretty reliable. But in low light, the shadow indicator is very unreliable. And I'll demonstrate that. So you still have to kind of revert back to spot metering to get the exposure correct. So I know I'm talking all in my vocabulary is just not what it used to be. I'm speaking very academically, right? But I'm going to give you a live demonstration, a more practical application of spot metering. So let me stop here and just look real quick at some questions. Oh, I've never heard of that, Leon. I have no idea. There's some new sensor array as well as a type of zoom lens. Interesting. I have no idea what that's about. Because I can, I love new gear and new technology as much as the next person, but I've been so busy with the live in-person training I've been doing And now I'm getting some requests for individual mentoring, right? So, I have to focus on the fundamentals, and then let the gear will take care of itself, right? If we can get better gear, better technology to help us do better photography, that will take care of itself. But generally, photography in of itself is still, and I hammer this in my live classes. Every class I talk about exposure. Exposure has to be right, and that's why I felt this topic uh, is 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 spot on, to use a to pun intended, to talk about exposure. Uh, so let me check. Let me check one other thing. Okay. Oh, hey, John. How are you? Don and Pam Starrett. Good to see you. That's a new name. I don't think I've seen you in the chat section before. Um, all right. So I've set up a little prop here with some flowers and a light, and let me go ahead and see if I can get that going without any technical issues. And I'll switch over to. Oh, Rick is here. Hey, Rick, how are you? Thanks for suggesting this topic. I think it's spot on for what we need. About exposure, which I'm a big proponent of getting exposure right. And like I said, in my professional work, I use spot metering 100% of the time. I mean, or 99%. About every scene I run into, I have to spot meter to make sure I get the exposure correct. Because the camera is intelligent auto exposure. They call it DSP or some, I don't know what they call it, but it's some automated things. Just doesn't cut it in real life sometimes. So let me find the right button. Let me see if I can. That's kind of there. There we go. All right. Hopefully everybody can see or at least hear me okay still. The sound might get a little random, echoey, or really deep and like this, because I have to reposition the mic a little bit. All right, so I have a scene here. Let me check my settings. I was playing around with this. Let's just go to standard matrix metering. Everything else looks fine. I guess I should. I dialed in my custom white balance things here. I like to make things a little bit warmer, but we'll just work with standards here, and we'll do a standard normal gradation. So this is pretty much the camera at the default settings, right? And I can cycle through the different live view info. I think. How come it's not changing back? Let me check. Live view info. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. When I'm hooked up through HDMI, it doesn't really toggle too well. It's a little glitch there. All right, so looking at this scene, right? It's just some flowers. I'm in the standard metering mode, right? What do they call it? What does Olympus call it? Just ESP metering. Okay, so ESP metering. There's center weighted metering, where basically it just measures mostly in the center, then graduates out to read the rest of the scene. And then we have spot metering, which reads right here in the center of the screen only. this one little circle, which is, they say, roughly 2% of the frame. And then there's spot high. It's actually abbreviated. It's spot highlights and then spot shadow. So it is spelled out right here, right? Although it looks misspelled to me, doesn't it? Shouldn't it be H-I-G-H? That's interesting. I never noticed that before. It should be H-I-G-H-L-I-T-E, not spot highlight. But I guess they can call it whatever they want. All right. So ESP basically looks at the entire scene and tries to measure what it thinks would be the correct exposure. And let me just crank up the ISO a little bit so our shutter speeds are a little better. Yeah, there, we'll do 1600. So we're 1/15 of a second, f5.6. And looking at the histogram below, now let me explain what the histogram does. The histogram, if we look, let's see if I can get my fingers in here. Right here, this is the histogram right underneath my finger. And all of the white pixels, or the white area, indicates or tells you how much, okay, I'm sorry. The histogram, this left side here is the dark side, okay? So as we move along the histogram, it tells you the exposure gets brighter and brighter and brighter all the way over to the right side, where the right side indicates completely white. The left side, anything touching on the far left side would be completely black. And you can see that the ESP metering was able to keep everything inside not being completely white or completely black. Now, when things do go completely black or completely white, meaning clipped with no detail in the shadows or the highlights, you'll see a little bit of a red dot here, maybe. And then on the left side, you would see a blue dot or a blue line, which you probably don't see it here because we're indoors, and I'll explain that later. But normally there would be a blue line hitting the left side of the histogram here. Now you'll also notice this green area here inside. That is sort of a mini histogram within the histogram. And what that's showing you is either what's dead center in the frame, the exposure dead center, or if you're in spot meter mode, it's going to show you the exposure right on the focus point here. So I think right now, let's see, if I go here, let's go to a bright area. Yeah, so right now, this is set up because the green area didn't change. Right now, this green area is showing you the spot meter histogram in the dead center of the frame. And, but you can adjust it so that the spot metering actually follows your focusing point. You can do that with the EM1s and the EM5s. I don't think you can do it with the EM10s. The EM10s, the spot meter is always on, but always in the center. So whether if you have an EM10 Mark II, you will still get this green area, but it's only going to represent the center of the frame, like I have the focus point here at all times. With the higher models, the EM5s and the EM1s, you can tie the spot metering to the focusing point. So that's the only difference between the two. So let's go ahead and just take a picture here. And well, let me format my card. I have to get rid of all my test shots first. There we go. So let's take a picture. And this is the standard ESP metering. And if we pull up the histogram, this histogram is showing you the data for the JPEG image, not the raw image. So you have to kind of take the histogram that you see here just as a guide, but not as an absolute correct representation. Now the good thing is that even in a JPEG image, if we look here on the far right, you can't see my finger now, but if you look at the far right, you'll see that there's hardly anything touching. There's just a little bit touching there on the far right, which would be indicative of the very bright flowers at the top. And then if you look at the far left, you can see nothing is touching the left side of the histogram. So that's telling me that I've not clipped anything completely to black. So if I need to recover any shadow detail, I can. Now, since this histogram is representing the JPEG image, the good news is if you're processing in RAW, you have about at least one stop of wiggle room on either side, meaning even if it's a little bit clipped on either side, if you're shooting RAW, you'll be able to bring in shadow and highlight detail back in when you're processing in RAW. So relatively speaking, this is an excellent histogram for this image, with the exception of, personally, I feel like the highlights are too bright. You know, if we just look at the image in terms of just the overall exposure, actually, I toggled over to the shadow highlight indicator, and you can see that there is a little bit of a blinky there of red on one of the flowers, telling me that at least in the JPEG image, let me get back there, the JPEG image, that area is clipped completely to white if we were just to share straight out of camera. But I'd argue that in RAW post-processing, you'd be able to bring that back because it's just so little, so very little of it. But the other problem with this image is we're not seeing very much detail at all in the flowers, right? So let's look at well, let me talk about this image a little bit more. Let's talk about the histogram. Let me toggle over to that. So if we look at the histogram, you see a lot of pixels are over on the left side, meaning a lot of the tones are dark, right? So that would represent probably most of the blue and the dark reds and the oranges and definitely the green leaves. All of that is what this white area, all the pixels, most of the pixels are on the left side, and then just only a few things are really middle gray or very bright. And then if you look all the way again to the far right, you can see a few pixels are touching the right side of the histogram, which is why we have this, you see this tiny bit of clipping in the highlight shadow indicator on the white flowers. Now, looking at this image, I would say to myself, you know, I don't like what the camera decided to do with the image because it's clipping the highlights too much, and it's showing too much of the leaves. Like, I don't really need to see a lot of detail down there in the leaves and the stem. I can probably block that out, you know, crush that all the way to black if I wanted to. And obviously the easiest way is just to dial in some exposure comp, and that's probably a lot closer, right? But sometimes exposure comp, you know, looking at what you see in the live view is not reliable, because there's a limit to what you can see in the live view. So let me go down to -3. Once I get to -3, it doesn't matter how much further I go. Like, I dialed in -5 exposure comp. The live view display does not change, right? It doesn't change until we get back to about -3, and then as I get brighter, now you can see it starts to change. And the same thing happens for the highlights. I go to +3 EV, but when I go over that, you can see the live view exposure does not change. And this is not unique to Olympus. There are other camera manufacturers. They have the sort of the same limitations. I would say it's about 50-50 or 80-20. I mean, not too many cameras really can show you much more beyond plus or minus 3 stops in the live view. And even if it does, it's very unreliable. However, if you use spot metering, you don't have to worry about what you see in the live view, because spot metering will always measure the exposure correctly. And the reason for the limitations in live view is because of the scan rate of the sensor when it's showing you the image. I don't want to get too technical, but just understand that, particularly when you're in low light situations, like I am, this room is relatively low light. The live view is even less reliable for determining the exposure. The only way you can determine the exposure was done correctly is if you take the picture and then look at it after you take the picture. So let's do a -3 exposure comp. Take a picture. And that looks pretty much exactly like what we saw in the live view. Let's go back to the live view. It's pretty close, right? But if I go to -5 and I take a picture, it's completely black. This is the picture here. Versus what do we see in the live view? See, the live view is still showing some of the flowers. So that's why live view is not a reliable way to correct for your exposure. So let me just take a break here and see if there's any questions on that part. So any questions on what I've talked about so far? Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's beyond the bit depth of the screen or viewfinder. If you're referring to what's being seen in the live view, yeah, I wouldn't say it's beyond the bit depth, because there are other cameras that can do it that are using the same tech, right? That's, the fact that it doesn't go darker, because okay, clearly, if I cover this up with my hand, I got the lens hood on, but it'll go completely black. And if I shine a light into this, it'll go completely white. So the limitation, I don't think, is the bit depth. I think it's a limitation of how they program the camera to display the live view. Yeah, it's definitely, I guarantee the bit depth is 8-bit on the monitor. It's a standard RGB live view display. So it's going to be 16 million colors on the live view. It's just the resolution is very limited. It's only a 1 million dot resolution. You divide that by 3, it's like a 0.3 megapixel image you're looking at. And I'm dividing by 3 because it's RGB, right? So you got to split it by 3 pixels to get a single color. Oh, how do you connect the metering to the focus point on the EM1 Mark II? You do that in the E menu, I believe. My EM1 Mark II, I'm using it for the live stream now, so I can't pull it off. Maybe I can do it with the M5. Should be pretty similar. Let me just check. E3 metering. Yeah, I believe it's menu E3. I'll display it. So if you go to menu E3, and I believe it's the same on the M1 Mark II, I can double check. Users. Oh wait, I have it on my desktop. This one. Manuals. EM1 Mark II, firmware 2, and search for spot. Spot AF, spot metering range, spots. Spot metering. Oh, they don't tell you the page. Page. So you can choose the camera how it meters. That's in the super control panel. Yeah, E3. Right here. So if you go to menu E3 and turn spot metering on, that'll tie the spot meter to the focus point on your camera. So it's the same on the M1 Mark III. Well, that's, yeah, on the M1 Mark II, that's what I'm looking at here. The M1 Mark II as it is the M1 Mark III. Okay, and yeah, the display is not going to do 16-bit. Every display is basically 8-bit sRGB. Even the HDR monitors are barely 10-bit. They do some kind of fake FRC 10-bit, most of the low-end monitors. And then when you get to the $1,000 plus monitors, they might be true 10-bit. But definitely the live view screen on our cameras are sRGB 8-bit, no question. Yeah, the M5 Mark II also has spot metering tied to the focus point. You just need to find it in the menu. Let me take a quick look. M5 version 1. E5 Mark III, Mark III. Oh, I don't have the E5 Mark II manual here. But it's in there. It's probably in the E menu as well. Okay. There's a wire in front of my head. Yes. That's for the... let me move this over a little bit, maybe. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. I left off with what? The histogram, basic histogram stuff, right? So let's go into spot metering and look at what it does, how it works. So number 5. Go back to zero exposure comp. All right, let's go back into the metering. Centered weighted metering, if I change it to this, it's not going to make much difference because it's just measuring the center, then going out gradually And most of the bright area here and the dark areas are all within the center anyway. So that's why the exposure just barely changes from 1/15 of a second. If you look at the shutter speed here to 1/13 of a second. So it's just barely makes any difference at all. And there's two things that happens when we go into spot metering. One is obviously goes into spot metering. And I believe, let me just make sure I got it turned off, because I want to talk about just like the EM10 Mark IIs, and this is actually the default setting. Let me turn these off. All right, so when I've turned off the spot metering link to be tied with the focus point, the spot metering, let me move my focus point over. You can see there's a circle right here in the center, and that's telling you that it is spot metering in the center. And you'll see this same circle on your EM10 Mark II. Now the exposure is, roughly the same, 1/15 of a second. But if I move this up to the brighter area, you can see that it's spot metering now for the white flower. And then as I move it back down here, this is a very dark area. We're down to about 1/15, 1/20. And if I go all the way down here, you can see we're at 1/5 of a second. So it's much darker down here than it is here, than it is here. And I'm going to turn on my light just to kind of exaggerate or increase the dynamic range of the scene. Now you can see the center is now 1/60th of a second. We're at 1/250th of a second down here. And then down here, we're still at about 1/5 of a second. So a lot of the light down here didn't make it, even though I turned my light on. And this is why in my professional photography, I use spot metering, because I can't rely on the blinkies so much, especially in the dark areas. Let me dial in like a -3. It's actually showing pretty well right now. But if I dial in -5, the blinkies haven't changed at all. The blue things in the shadows, right? From -3 down to -5, there's no difference. And when I'm working with very high dynamic range scenes, this is why you can't rely on the highlight shadow indicators, because if you're beyond 3 stops of difference in dynamic range, which is very common, even out, especially outdoors, it's not reliable. But I can always rely on the spot meter and look at the shutter speed. So I know that that's 1/60th of a second, whether the blue highlight shadow meters are showing or not. And same thing with this highlight area. You can see that's at 1/3200th of a second. It's mainly because I've dialed in -3 exposure comp. Let me dial that back to 0. But this is much more reliable than the blinkies. So I'm at +3, but even if I dial in +5, you can see the highlight shadow indicators, they haven't changed. But look at the shutter speed at +5, it's 1/13th of a second. Versus at +3, it's 1/50th of a second. So, full 2 stops. Because, a lot of people, they make the argument that, you don't need to spot meter because you can just look at the highlight shadow indicators. And you really can't because they're not reliable. So what you see in the live view is not reliable. And then what you see as far as highlight and shadow indicators is not reliable versus spot metering directly. Okay. So that's the spot meter. And then, like I was saying, well, we'll work with this center spot only. So let's say I want to spot meter on the flowers here. I don't want them blown out too much. This is way too dark. So maybe I want something right in here. And that looks pretty good. So right here, we're at, let's say 1/320th of a second. Right here, we're at about 1/80th of a second, or 1/60th. And down here, we're at roughly 1/10th of a second. So doing the exposure math in my head real quick, 1/250th down to 1/60th of a second, let's say, is what? 2 stops difference, right? Because we're at 250, we go to 125, then half that is 1/60th. So it's roughly 2 stops difference from here to here, which is perfectly fine. And then from here, from 1/250th of a second down to here, we'll say 1/10th, right? So we're at, we start at 250, now we're at 125, 1/60th, 1/30th, 1/15th. So it's a little over 5 stops difference between here and down here, right? So knowing that my sensor's capable, really, they say it's capable of 10 or 11 stops, but in reality, you want to work within 7 stops of light to make sure that you can capture all of the highlights and all of the shadows. So if you do that exposure math via shutter speed or via aperture or via ISO, however you want to do it, I'm using shutter speed in this case to try to figure out the difference in exposure from the brightest area to the darkest area. That's telling me I've got about a 5-stop difference between the brightest area and the darkest area, which is well within the 7-stop range that I like to work with, especially if I'm going to do any post-processing and I want to recover highlights and shadows. If I keep the entire scene within 7 stops, then I know I won't have any troubles bringing the highlights and shadows in. So I know that could be very confusing information, or that's a lot of information or technical for people that are not familiar with working with exposure in terms of stops. So let me just take a quick look at the questions here, because I see a couple. Okay, screw the green screen. Oh, well, actually, I like to see the chat section. So Drew is asking, what's the large white square popping up? That is the face detect in the autofocus, which I'll talk about how that's affected as well when we're working with spot metering. Your life is a lie. So let's see. So this was the question from Druid. What's the white square that pops up? So you'll see a little white square pop up time to time. So the camera thinks it's seeing a face in the flowers. It's not too dissimilar to like when we look at clouds and we see faces in the clouds. Camera face detect is kind of the same way. It's looking at the scene and it thinks it sees a face when there's not really one there. And John Truman says, I missed the beginning of the stream, but is there a rule of thumb for what situations would use each of the metering modes for? I tend to leave my OMDs in matrix. Yeah, the matrix, or ESP metering, as Olympus calls it. Yeah, I tend to do that too, generally speaking. But the times that I do want to go into spot metering is when I'm in very high dynamic range scene, and I want to know if I can capture all of that highlight and shadow detail within the camera's ability, or within what most cameras can handle, 7 stops total dynamic range. So if I'm very critical about my exposure, I'm going to spot meter the brightest area and the darkest area and see if the difference is more than 7 stops. If it goes to 8 stops, I might let it go, depending. But if it goes beyond that, let's say there's a 12-stop difference between the brightest area and the darkest area, which is not uncommon outdoors, then I have to make a decision, right? Am I going to bracket the shot so I capture everything? So I do an HDR bracketing plus or minus 2 stops, maybe 3 stops, or do I make a decision about which detail do I want to capture more? Do I want to capture the highlights and all of the beautiful colors? Let's say it's a landscape. If I want to capture the beautiful colors in the sky, and I can ignore the foreground, which is very dark trees, and they're all just green trees anyway, right? For example, then I might sacrifice the foreground and the trees for the detail in the sky if I have this beautiful sky. However, let's say it's fall colors, right? And you got these beautiful colors in the trees and the landscape. I might want to sacrifice the brightness of the sky and let the clouds and everything get clipped so I can capture the colors of the trees. And it's very hard to know how much you're going to capture if without spot, if you have to make that decision without spot metering. Because in the old days, I wouldn't even say the old days. I'd say most professional photographers they'll use a little spot meter and measure a scene for a landscape. Sakonic has a plethora of spot meters, that have that, so that landscape photographers can measure the dynamic range of the scene and then set their exposure to capture what it is they primarily want to focus on. Because if they find the scene is greater than 7 or 8 stops, they know they're going to have to make a choice. Either bracket the scene so they can capture the skies and the foreground, or make a decision: do I want to capture the beautiful sky and the tones in the sky and the clouds, or do I want to capture the tones and colors in the foreground, say for example in the fall? So rule of thumb is, if it's a high dynamic range scene and you want to get your exposure as perfect as possible for the scene that you want to capture, then spot metering can make a difference. And as I was saying before, you can't rely on the highlight shadow indicators. Never rely on that. You can't rely on what you see in the live view, because the live view has a 6-stop range, plus or minus 3 stops of what it can show you on the screen. And that's by design by Olympus. Some cameras, they do better, right? They can show you more than 6 stops, plus or minus. But with our Olympus cameras, we're limited to just that 6-stop range anyway. So that's why spot metering, you don't have to be limited by what you see in the live view. You can measure the exposure. And, if you have a little trouble with the math, bring a pen and pad and work it out. But spot metering will help you do that without having to buy one of those separate dedicated spot meters. You can just use your camera, assuming 2% of the frame is tight enough. Because I think the Sakonic spot meters, they get down to 1% of the frame, which is twice as good, right? And let me check some of the other questions. It says here, as far as I know, the only way to make a JPEG's metering reflect the actual value is to use uni white balance. I have no idea what that is. At that point, the JPEGs will reflect the highlights. If you could elaborate on it a little bit, that's new to me. I don't know what uni WB is. I assume it's white balance is what the WB, but I don't know. That's new. That's new information. And then Rick has a comment. Technically, it's not possible to capture this contrasting image without post-processing the raw file. The point is not to blow the highlights, as blown highlights are irrecoverable. Yeah, and I'll expand on that a little bit too. Like I said, what you're seeing in the histogram is the JPEG representation, right? And I guess when you're in live view, it's reading directly off the sensor, so maybe that might be a little more accurate. But either way, you really can't rely on it, mainly because it's hard to read, how many pixels are off and blown out and clipped. And if you can't use the highlight shadow indicators, you can't since you can't rely on that, you can't use that because you can't rely on it either. So really the only way is to just spot meter. And what Rick is saying is that highlights, yeah, generally cameras, digital cameras have will clip the highlights completely to white so that you cannot recover any details. The shadow area, however, has a little more wiggle room. Somehow, the way digital cameras work and what I've read is that the shadow areas capture a lot more detail, a lot more information that can be processed than the highlights do. So bringing up shadows and dark areas with a digital image is is a lot easier to do in the shadow and dark areas than it is in the highlights, because the way digital files are recorded, a lot more data is recorded in the shadow areas. And of course, regardless of what ISO you're in, when you're recovering detail in the shadows, you are going to recover the noise as well, because the shadow areas are very close to the noise floor of the sensor. And by raising the details in the shadows, so say the noise floor is here, your shadows are here, your highlights are up here in terms of data. As you raise the noise, the shadow, you're raising the noise with it. So just be conscious of that when you're recovering shadow detail in your raw images. You will bring some of the noise with it. And yeah, 1% is really tight, right? Yeah, and John, you'd say, and a lot of you have experience with this, right? But John, you'd say is just reinforcing the point that if you're going to make a mistake, it's better to underexpose with digital, right? Whereas with film, it was the opposite. You know, film, people say film, it's almost impossible to blow out film, highlights in film. I guess the way the chemistry works. But that's just stuff I've seen. Okay, John Matthews. Oh, hold on. Before I get to that, there's a question. Would you advise to link the spot metering to your focus point if you want to expose for a particular area, HDR environment? Linking it to the focus point makes sense to me. It does, yeah. You can definitely link. I always link when I'm doing my professional work. I link the uh, exposure, the spot meter to the focus point, mainly for compositional reasons, not because I'm trying to do HDR. I'm doing HDR anyway. The only reason I link the focus point to the spot meter is because of composition. Because if I'm on a tripod and I want to spot meter the top left corner because I framed the shot, now that I frame the shot, I can just move the focus point to the different points within the frame without moving the camera. And that's why I do it. I mean, if you have a EM10, for example, or a camera that only spot meters the center, it's a little awkward to measure different points of the scene, and then frame your scene after you've moved your camera all around, right? So it's just a workflow issue for me. It's not really a technical issue like I'm trying to do HDR. I'm always doing HDR, but from a workflow compositional, in terms of composition, it's much easier just to move the focus point around and check these highlights and shadows, or check the exposure at the different points. And then John is elaborating here. Uni white balance changes the white balance to reflect mainly the green values. When you do this, you will end up with a green dominant JPEG that accurately reflect the raw image. That's interesting. I'm gonna have to research that. That's not something I can explain, obviously, because I've never heard of it before. But that's interesting, John. So that'll be good uh, research for everyone here today to look into that as well. If you've never heard of it, because I've never even heard of that. That's interesting. Um, Then he followed, I don't do it anymore. Yeah, I get it. I mean, like I said, 90% of the time I don't need it for my normal photography, but for my for my professional work, I definitely use spot metering. Spot metering, I don't have to think. You know, the spot meter tells me exactly what the exposure is. Yeah. Pentax and Minolta spot meters for SIN work. Great for checking exposure on subjects and persons when you can't get close to take an incident light reading. Absolutely. Jeff brings up, well, let me leave that up there. Jeff's bringing up another vocabulary word here, incident, right? There's incident lighting and there's reflective lighting. So the difference being is, for example, on my mug here, the light that's being reflected off of this is what our cameras are reading for exposure. And incident, you're reading the light from the source. So I would point the camera at the light source versus um, what's being reflected off this mug. So there's incident and reflective. And those are the two main differences, right? So what I would do is, I don't have a real spot meter, but if this was a spot meter, I would put it here to read the light hitting it onto the subject versus I would put the spot meter over here and it would be reading the light being reflected back to the front of the spot meter. So that's what he means by incident reading, in case you didn't know. and yeah, the color profile affects the histogram. Muted shows closer to raw, but raw is no longer raw as it has a color profile which has curves rounded to the highlights. Yes. And again, so the histogram is really just a guide, and getting the colors and everything correct in the histogram, meaning the brightness, different brightness values of colors. I mean, this was, this is more of a film thing, really, because different films had different sensitivities to different colors. And our sensors are not quite as sensitive that way. They are more sensitive to reds, and that might affect it. But we're really splitting hairs here, I think, in terms of being able to read a histogram. But technically, DeMorgan is correct. And we'll look at how and why you often don't want both focus and spot metering points to be the same. I keep hitting the wrong button here. Can a mirrorless camera spot meter with just 1 pixel? No. No, they're going to take a 2% reading, which is, what is that? What's 2% of 20 megapixels? 400 pixels? So, or is it 400,000? It's 4,000 pixels, I think. That'd be 4 megapixels. It'd be 400 pixels, I believe, would be 2%. I don't know. Now my math is getting foggy. But I'm sorry, I didn't show the question. Can a mirrorless camera spot meter with just 1 pixel? I guess technically it could, but that kind of precision, I can't imagine anybody would need that. But generally, it's 2% of whatever the megapixels are on your camera. Spot. Yep. Incident and reflective readings would be the same with an 18% gray card for the reflective light reading. Oh, that would be true. I don't know why they would be different, right? Incident versus reflected. Assuming you're exactly at that point of reference. But yeah, that's why we can just use the spot meters in our camera. Um, Generally speaking, unless the area is very small and our spot meters, 2% will be too much, right? Maybe we want to measure less than 2%, right? Then an incident reading might be more accurate. And yeah, that's true. Film is organic, right? So it's going to capture everything just like our own eyes, but it's going to capture, all more colors generally speaking. And then they're formulated to be more sensitive to certain colors than others. And that's why all the films have their own kind of character. Okay, so let's go to the other metering modes, spot highlight and spot shadow. Let me just get a quick sip here. Okay, now we're still in center spot metering only mode, right? We haven't tied the spot meter to the focus point. So for people that have a fixed spot meter, meaning you can't tie it to the focus point, how would you adjust for this frame easily? Because the EM10s do have the ability to lock the exposure. So if I wanted a spot meter on just the flowers right here, I want this to have its I want this to be, the perfect 18% gray. Let's look at the histogram, see if that's, you see the green area, how it's right in the center now? So what the spot meter has done is brought everything down to what Jeff referenced as 18% gray, but this is a very neutral exposure or middle gray, which is what cameras are designed to do to bring to give you a proper exposure. So you can see the green area, whereas I move down here, you can see that green area is struggling a little bit to bring the exposure up to 18% gray. It's more spread out, but it very easily does it on completely white areas versus colors. Colors it struggles a little bit with, right? Which is what we were talking about earlier. But anyhow, what I would do is I need to go into the menu and let's see. Hold on. What am I doing? Oh, okay. We need to go into the button menu. And in the button menu, maybe it's an AEL AFL first. Okay, I'm sorry. It's in the autofocus menu, and this will be true on the M10. You want to go to the AEL AFL, and you want to make. And if you're using single point autofocus, the default setting is mode 1, and this will lock your exposure when you push the AEL button on your camera, which in this case on the M1 Mark III is it has a dedicated AEL AFL button, but the M10, for example, does not. So you have to assign it to a function button. Let me just check the modes real quick. Mode 2, mode 3, okay. So let's do it this way first. So we're in mode 1. So what that means is half pressing the shutter button, it will lock the exposure and lock the autofocus. Fully pressing the shutter button will take the picture. And then your AEL button, if your camera has it built in, like the EM1 Mark III, you can push it and it will lock the exposure first, and then you can focus on a different point. And if you have an EM10 Mark II, for example, what you have to do is you have to go into the button menu, because the EM10s don't have an AEL button. You go into the button function and you assign a function button. Let's say, oh, where are they? Oh, EM10 doesn't call them or EM1 doesn't call them function buttons anymore. But you can assign, I would assign probably like this button. They call it ISO on this camera, but let me just get my EM10 out. Where is it? I'm an idiot. My EM10 is right here. On the EM10, you go in the button function, function 1, change this to AEL, AFL, like this, right? And then go into your autofocus menu and change single point autofocus to mode 1, just like so. So now function 1 button will lock exposure. So now I can kind of demo this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my spot meter up to this point, hit the AEL button or function 1 if it's an EM10, and you'll see a little green icon pop up, you know, right there. And that now the exposure is locked. So you can see the exposure is not changing no matter where I point the camera. The spot meter, you know, the exposure has been locked to that one point. Now I can half press the shutter button and focus anywhere I want in the frame. So I can move my focus point over here, half press, and the exposure doesn't change because I've locked it. So this is how you spot meter from one area and focus in a different area. So if I just want to focus, say, on the orange flowers, I could do that. But since I want to focus on the white flowers because that's what I metered for, I could do that and then take the picture and whoops. And then when I zoom in, the flowers are what's in focus there. So just a little trick. I didn't explain this too well in my video that I made about this topic. But you can focus on a different part than you meter on. So let me turn off the exposure lock. And let's say I want to meter the orange flowers. I will lock the exposure to that, and then I can focus on those, or I can focus on the same white flower and take a picture. And then when I zoom in, it's blown out, but the white flower is in focus. The orange ones are kind of in focus too, but that's just because they're pretty much on the same focus plane and depth of field and all of that. But this is how you can meter for one particular scene. You know, you can meter for a particular brightness and then focus on a different part of the scene. So a good example would be, you know, I want to meter for the sky and the clouds, but I want to focus 1/3 into the frame trying to get that maximum depth of field so that I get everything in focus. So I can focus on maybe 1/3 into the frame on a landscape, and then the clouds will be in focus and the landscape will be in focus. So let me just stop there real quick, because I don't want to lose anybody, because that's kind of a big deal, right? Metering for a different part of the scene, then recomposing so you can get the focus point that you want, and take the picture that way so that you get the focus and the framing that you want, but then also the metering at the same time. Yeah, and Rick and Jeff are expanding on the incident light readings. Yeah, reflected light, of course, is going to be affected by uh, the tones in the thing and the colors that you're taking a picture of, and that's why Jeff is saying uh, this is why people use gray cards, right? I don't have one here. I'm using this now. Where is it? I'm using this spider cube thing now. This is an interesting little device. It's a little pricey, but it's a specialized tool, right? So of course they're going to charge a lot. And they've been making this since 2015, so it must be relatively popular for them to continue this particular product for the last 6 years at this price point. I've seen it for less. I've seen it for as little as like $25, $30, which maybe you're like, ooh, that's a lot. But this normal price is like $60 or $55. But this has a perfect 18% gray here, and then a white. It's not a pure white. It's white, but it's not bright white. I forget what percentage white this is. And then it has a little trap here to capture black areas. So it's actually just a hole that you can, and you would use this in raw processing. This wouldn't be something you could really do in camera. And it has a chrome ball up here as well for highlights and things. So it's really interesting. And 1/4 20 screw. But anyway, I'm going to do a video on that because I'm obligated to, because they gave it to me for free. But I thought this, they gave me a lot of choices to review things. And I said, well, let me try this one. This one is actually interesting because, like I said, exposure is always sort of my, it's the core thing of photography. And this will help you get exposure and white balance and all of that stuff. Right. And okay, so Michael understands, and Marcia is going to watch again. And Talos is late. Sorry, Talos. The Morgan has a question. Does spot exposure follow the face tracking or just manually moved points? Yes. Face tracking, when you link the focus point to the spot meter, face detect is automatically turned off. So I'll show you that. On the EM1s, I'm not 100% sure about, well, yeah, on the EM10, I'm not 100% sure. But the EM1s, the face tracking is disabled so that it doesn't expose for the person's face and only expose on the place you're spot metering. And Rick's giving another example. Like if I'm taking a picture of my dog Ellie, and she's a black and white dog, right? If I want to make sure her fur is not completely crushed to black, the black part of her fur, and I want to capture the tones and the shades and her muscles, that are bulging out through her fur, then I would have to expose for her fur in a way that would show those tones without clipping them completely to black. And is there a big difference? Yeah, it's a huge difference. Black shirts reflect less light, right? If you're just spot metering the one part of the shirt, whatever that might be, it's going to be a big difference between this and a white shirt, definitely. And yeah, Rick makes a good point. If it's kind of a polyester and has it's shiny, yeah, the reflectivity of the shirt would make a difference. That's true. I'm thinking of just a cotton black, a flat white. But if they're reflective, 1970s disco polyester black, yeah, there would be some variance there, definitely. And yep, Jerky is saying, yeah, it uses AEL a lot for sky, right? Which makes sense. You want to get the exposure in the sky correct, so you can lock exposure on that, so you capture all of the tones. Because particularly in sunsets and sunrises, there's lots of colors in the sky, and if you don't meter for that correctly, you're going to lose all of that color. What was a question I wanted to get to? Yeah, incident. You have to be careful with incident. You can't do incident reading with your camera, because incident light meters, they have like a dome or diffuser on them to measure the light, and then it accounts for the light that's subtracted by that dome diffuser. If you're just pointing your camera at the light source this way, you don't know what you're going to get, to be honest. Um, so I would never use a camera for incident light reading. It's just not designed to do that. And if you try to put a white plastic dome over the top, that's gonna that's going to mess up your exposure as well, because the dome would reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor. Um, and light meters are designed with all that built in to give you the correct exposure. And really, I only see people using incident light metering nowadays mostly for flash work, in portrait studios or in a studio and product photography portrait. They might use incident lighting readings for their flashes, so they can set their flashes manually. But most people, I think, just use the meters in their camera and do reflective metering. Okay, there was a question here I wanted to expand on. Oh, it has to do with the face detect, right? Okay. Uh, let's go back to the camera. So since we have an EM1, we can tie the focus point to the or we can tie spot metering to the focus point. So we do this in menu E3. We go down here and we turn on spot metering, spot highlight, spot shadow. So you can have it only work with spot metering, spot highlight, spot. You can pick all or none, but I'm just going to select all. So now you'll notice that the little green circle is gone, and wherever I move my focus point, you can see the exposure changes. So if I want to expose all the way over here on the yellow flowers, on the white flowers, on the orange flowers, etc., you can see how the exposure changes. And the other thing you'll notice is face detect is now off, this right here. If I go back to regular mode, you can see that like in ESP metering and center weighted metering, face detect, eye detect, all that's on. But when I go to spot metering and I tie the spot metering to the focus point, face detect turns off. So you don't have to worry about, at this point, the camera trying to meter the person's face, because it's going to ignore that because it's being turned off. So again, you'll see face detect is on, and as soon as I go into spot metering mode, but if I turn off these things, right, face detect is back on. So if the camera detects a face in the frame, it's gonna meter on the person's face and not where you spot metered. So you have to be conscious of that. Unless you're using AEL, then I can lock it here like so. And then it's not going to meter for the person's face. But let's go ahead and turn these back on. And so right now we're just in spot meter. So what it's done is basically it's tried to make this white area here, this white flower, 18% gray. If we do spot meter high, or spot meter highlights, that's what they call it here, highlight, which is misspelled in my opinion. What it's doing is it's trying to make sure that the white areas are white as possible, or as bright as possible without getting clipped. But it can still clip, even though in practice it does not normally do that. It doesn't normally clip the highlights when you go to spot highlights. So the way you use spot highlight is you select spot highlight here, and then you put the focus point on the brightest part of the frame. You pick the brightest area. So I would not want to pick, for example, I would not want to pick, oops, I'm sorry. I was trying to move the focus. For example, I would not want to pick an area over here, because now it's going to try and make that blue area the brightest part of the frame, or very bright. So you want to pick the brightest part of the frame to pick spot highlight. So if I take a picture here, you can see that the white flowers are very bright and almost to the point of white, but you can probably still recover. So this is not too dissimilar to, I would say, exposing to the right. If we look at the histogram, well, let me take that back. Let's talk about how to use spot shadow, and then we'll look at the histograms and compare them. If we go to spot shadow, the way you use this is you move the focus point to the darkest part of the frame. For example, probably right there. Let me see. This is not as dark. I think this is the darkest part of the frame right here. Yeah, right there. So now what you're telling the camera to do is, or the intent of spot metering shadow, is to make the shadow areas as dark as possible, if not completely black, and bring down the rest of the exposure along with it. So in theory, this would be, let's look at the histogram. This feels like it's exposing. Let's just ignore exposing to the right, exposing to the left. I don't use those techniques, so that's why I'm having a little trouble articulating it. But you can see that the histogram, particularly the green area, the spot meter histogram is all the way to the left of the scene. And if I take a picture here, ideally, we're going to save some of the highlight information better without destroying the dark areas. But this process using spot high and spot low is just a quick and dirty way of doing exposure comp. So what do I mean by that? What the camera does is it takes a normal 18% gray reading, just like it would here. It takes this reading here to get the middle gray, right? Or 18% gray metering. And then if you're in spot high, all it's doing is adding 2 1/3 stops of light. So it's just raising the exposure by 2.3 stops. Sometimes 2, but usually about 2.3 stops. So it's not re-metering the area. It's metering the area for 18% gray, and then it adds 2.3 stops to the entire scene. So it's just in other words, it's like an exposure comp shortcut. And spot shadow, what it does is it does the same thing. It meters the scene for 18% gray, then subtracts 3 stops from the exposure. Okay, so let's just do a very simple example. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a spot meter on this orange flower and take a picture. And let's look at the EXIF data. Oh, I lost it. Let me go into the display menu. Playback info. There. So look at the data here. We're at 1/100th of a second, and that's the only variable because I've locked the aperture at f5.6 and I've locked the ISO at 1600. So the only thing the camera can do is adjust the shutter speed. So when I measured this in normal spot metering, I got 1/100th of a second. Now if I go to spot high, it's going to raise that by 2.3 stops. Roughly. So if I take a picture now, and I haven't moved the focus point, right? So now we're at 1/125th of a second. So what is that exactly? If we're at 1/100th, we go to 1/50th and then 1/25th. So in this case, it moved it 2 stops. Sometimes it goes 2 1/3 stops. Normally it's 2 1/3 stop, but in this case, it did it 2 stops because the shutter speed just doesn't have that kind of precision, I guess. So we've done high, right? We're 2 stops. Now let's not move the focus point and change this to shadow, spot shadow. Take a picture. Now you can see we're at 1/800th of a second. So that's 3 stops difference, right? We were at 1/100th of a second. 1/200th of a second would be a stop. 1/400th of a second would be another stop. 1/800th of a second is 3 stops. And that's all highlight and shadow is doing, right? It's adding 2 stops for highlights just to brighten it up, and it's subtracting 3 stops for shadows. And if you're in a very high dynamic range scene, because we're only working with 5 stops between the highlights and shadows in this case, if we choose a spot highlight or spot shadow. Stuff can still clip. You can still clip highlights, you can still clip shadows, even though you're spot metering doing spot highlights and spot shadows. But that's what I was saying, most photography, you want to make sure when you're metering that your entire scene is within 7 stops. Because that's generally really the maximum dynamic range that you can recover good detail in the highlights and shadows. So let me stop here and see if there's any questions there. Oh, hey, Randy, how are you? Wow, Jeff has a Spectra incident light meter. Wow, that's interesting. Back from the film days. Wow. I know, Jeff. That's what I was saying in your email the other day. It's fascinating, the stuff that you do or have done in your life. So Rick is, let's see, Rick is elaborating here. Normally, spot metering treats the metering point as the average value to use for the whole picture. So you need spot high to tell the camera that your reading is for the brightest part of the image. And I think in practice, that is the idea, right? Is you're trying to meter for the highlights. So you put your spot meter and focus point onto the brightest part of the scene, and it meters that for 18% gray, but spot high, it just adds 2 stops. So it's not measuring specifically for things that will clip. It's just measuring 18% gray, then adding 2 stops. But there's still potential in very high dynamic range scenes for it to clip. And I have tested this in extremely bright situations, extremely dark situations, and every time the camera in spot high will add 2 stops or 2 1/3 stops, more often 2 1/3 stops, or it always subtracts 3 stops when you're in spot shadow. So it's a very it's not a an intelligent measuring. Spot high and spot low doesn't add any intelligence. It still measures 18% gray, and then it's just physically adding 2 stops or subtracting 3 stops to the exposure, depending if you're doing spot highlights or spot shadows. And he goes on, spot high will ensure the metered part of the image is what you see on the right side of the histogram without blowing the whites. And that is the intent of spot highlight, is if you're at 18% gray, you should be able to add 2 stops to the scene and not blow out the highlights, right? 2 stops is well within the range of a micro four thirds sensor's dynamic range. 2 stops over 18% gray, and certainly 3 stops below 18% gray. Because like we were saying earlier, shadow area has a lot more data, recoverable data, than the highlights do. So that's why the highlights, it only does +2 stops with spot high and -3 stops with spot shadow, because shadow areas have a lot more data to recover than highlights do. And Sujana's here. Hello. Drew is asking, what is +A and +G? And that's for shifting your white balance, right? So if you have your white balance set to whatever, you can set your white balance, unless it's a custom white balance. If you set your white balance to auto, you set it to sunny, whatever. Let's say you set it to auto, you can shift the white balance from the automatic reading. So the camera will capture what it thinks is the correct white balance, but then you can force it to shift A and G. So A is like amber, G is green. So amber is basically sort of your reds. So you can shift it more red, and then G is your greens. You can shift the greens. So you can make the image cooler or warmer by shifting between green and I think it's magenta. And then amber, well, let me just pull it up for you. It's a lot easier to see. So here it is in the super control panel, right? So I can shift it between the amber, which is really the reds, and blue. So this will make the image cooler. This will make the image warmer. And the green's the same thing. This will make the image greener. This will make the image more magenta. You know, magenta generally being considered a warmer color and green being a cooler color. And if I put this, get this out of spot high, so you should be able to see that's cooler. It may not be too obvious. This should be warmer. And if I crank this all the way down, that'll make it even warmer versus, you can see I'm adding greens. And let me push the blues. So this is a little cooler image. I'll take a picture here. Then, and I'll just crank this up without going all the way in. This would be the warmest image I can do. So if we look at this image, so this is the warmer image. This is the cooler image. So picture 11, picture 12. See the difference? So it's mainly for just doing creative things. I suppose there could be some technical things you can do. Oops. Okay, and Walter's there. Hey, Walter. Is my audio and video out of sync? I don't know. Try refreshing your browser, or it could be my end. There's not much I can do about it. It is a tiny bit off. I might have to adjust my OBS to sync properly. I don't know where the problem is, if it's in the OBS or in the streaming software that I'm using. And Petra's here. And John Truman saying, with film cameras that don't have a light meter, I'm successfully using Sunny 16, but having spoken with Randy, I bought a ZB M08. Oh yeah, the cold shoe. It is pretty accurate. That's true. I have one. It works pretty well. I don't know if I have that exact model, but I have one of those separate light meters you can attach to the camera. And let's see, Rick is elaborating. Of course not. Of course, spot metering for shadow is always a problem, as often not enough photons are hitting the sensor for an accurate reading, especially in very low light. Yes. Does it affect exposure? Not much, if any. Splitting hairs. Maybe if it does, I haven't noticed it, but if it does, it's very, very minimal. So just consider, just for all intents and purposes, it does not. It does, certainly affects your perception of light, right? Because there's a difference between brightness and God, I can't remember now. But our perception of what is bright and what is dark is different, right? Like the color yellow looks brighter than the color blue to our eyes, right? But they could be at the same brightness level. So I think the difference is brightness and luminance. I can't remember. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, there's no difference in brightness or exposure. It's just our perception of brightness, right? Based on the colors. So warmer colors may seem a little brighter and cooler colors seem a little darker, generally speaking. But the overall brightness of the image, the exposure would be exactly the same. It's just our perception. Okay, so that was that. And then, of course, you can lock the exposure using the AEL button if it's dedicated, or if you can assign a function button to AEL and lock the exposure to whatever you metered, whether it's spot high, spot low, single spot, and then focus on a different point. So like in my professional work, it's not uncommon for me to, let me switch to, it's not uncommon for me to meter up here. Oops, let me make sure I'm in spot. So it's not uncommon for me to meter up here. So this might be a very bright window, right? But then let's say the orange flowers and things are like furniture, right? Those are definitely underexposed. It's not uncommon for me to meter here for this. And usually actually, because I'm using flash, I'm in full manual mode. But I will meter for this. So what I'll do is, let me go into manual mode and I'll show you how I use this professionally. And I am always in mechanical shutter. So I'll meter for this until, and I'm using the EV meter right here. See where it says plus 0.07? So I know that's 18% gray for the window. And windows are usually naturally, to our eyes, they look brighter. So I will add usually one stop. So I know that's my exposure for the window if I was doing a living room, for example. And then I might want to focus not on the window, but focus on the um, furniture. And now you see how the EV meter's gone to minus 0.7. I could ignore that. I don't have to worry about that because I know that I've spot metered correctly +1 for the windows because I want the windows to look brighter than the rest of the room, right? I don't want the windows to be the same brightness as the furniture. I want them to be brighter. So this is how I measure the windows. And then I'll focus on, say, the furniture inside because I don't want stuff outside to be sharp. I want the furniture and all of the fixtures inside the living room to be sharp. And this is how I do it with my professional work. And then what I'll do is I'll use a flash, set the flash manually to properly expose. I don't have a flash here, but you get the idea. Is I'll use a flash to brighten up the furniture so that it's properly exposed. Now in this scene here, the dynamic range is pretty limited. It looks like it's only 2 stops difference between the orange and the white. See, it's -1 there, and it's +1 there. So it's only 2 stops difference. But in a real estate setting like a living room where the windows are very bright and the furniture is very dark, it's easily 7-8 stops difference. So I have to meter for the windows versus metering for the furniture separately. Okay. So that's, I think, all I needed to show for spot metering high, spot metering low. And like I said, the most important thing when you're metering is just get a feel for what the dynamic range in the scene is first by using the spot metering. Try to stay within the 7 stops dynamic range, right? And this goes all the way back to the zone system, I believe, to some extent, right? Usually it's within 7 stops. I don't know exactly, but I believe it dates back to the zone system, and it still holds true to this day that you can capture most detail and highlights and shadows within 7 stops of a sensor. Going beyond that, you will still get data, but once you're beyond 7 stops on either side, you start to lose some data, some information, particularly in the highlights. The highlights get blown very quickly. So using spot metering helps you determine if you're within that range for a single exposure, because sometimes you have to capture it in one frame. Or if you have a choice, if you can bracket, you can force the exposure to be compressed or captured all of that detail. And using spot high and spot low is just a shortcut to exposure compensation, where spot high is doing the standard 18% gray exposure, then adding 2 stops, and spot shadow or spot SH is just subtracting 3 stops from 18% gray on that particular spot. The EM10s, you have to sort of, the spot meter is only in the center. You can't tie it to the focus point. So you'll always have to move your camera around within the frame of the scene that you're going to capture and take those readings. And it might be helpful for you to write it down. If you're not really great with numbers, you can write it down and sort of figure out what the range is. It's gotten to the point I can kind of do it in my head. And if you have a very trained eye, you can just walk to any scene and almost look at it with your naked eye and tell what the exposure should be, right? If you have a very trained eye. So I'm pretty good indoors. Like if I walk into a scene, living room, office building, whatever, I have a pretty good feel for what exposure and the dynamic range is in the scene because I've done so many that my eye is very trained for interiors and the differences between the light outside and the light inside. But your eyes play tricks on you too, so you can't rely on that, right? You still have to meter things. And then, like I said, tying the focus point to, or tying the spot meter to the focus point on, say, the EM5s and the EM1s is really a workflow issue for me where it just saves me time. I can focus the frame and get the framing and composition that I want. Then I can move the focus point around the scene and measure the lighting in the different areas to capture the exposure that I want to capture. So, okay, so any questions? Oh, hold on. Rick says, how about a quick run through of your workflow for taking a picture using AEL button and half shutter button to capture focus before shifting to your final framing, no flash? Okay, I think I just did that, but I'll do it one more time. It's very quick. Let me do this one time, just in case because I wasn't thinking in those terms. I think I did it, but I wasn't thinking directly. So let's do quick run through workflow for taking a picture using AEL button, then half pressing. Okay, I can do that. Because the way I did it in full manual mode, which is kind of the same thing. Let's see. So let me put this, let's say you're an aperture priority, right? And I'm in spot meter. So I'm going to do this spot high. So I want the flowers to be as white as possible without clipping, and that should be no problem. And what I'll do is I will lock the auto exposure by clicking the AEL button. So again, on my EM1 Mark II and EM1 Mark III, we have dedicated AEL buttons. On your EM10s, you have to program a function button to be your AEL button, which I showed earlier in the stream. And then let's say I don't want to actually focus on that flower. I want to focus on these orange flowers down here. So now I'm focusing down here, but my exposure is up here, right? But I'm focusing down here, and then I can take a picture like so. So that's the basic workflow. And you have to make sure that you're in the A menu, your AEL is set to mode 1. And on the EM1, it breaks it down into all the different focusing modes. But let's look at the other modes. So halfway press will auto exposure lock and focus, right? So what I can do is I can half press the shutter button. So now it's locked exposure and it's locked focus, but only on that point. Moving around, my focus and my exposure is locked. But in mode 1, as you can see, I can also use the AEL button to lock the exposure and then focus on a different point. So I can lock the exposure here. Now you see the green AEL right here, right? And then, well, that's not clear, but right here. And then I can refocus anywhere else that I want in the frame and take the picture. If we look at mode 2 is forcing the shutter button to only do autofocus when you press halfway. And it won't lock the exposure until you fully press the shutter button. So this one is, or I can do the AEL, which will lock the exposure regardless of what I do with the shutter button. So in this mode, basically, let me look at it one more time. I rarely use mode 2. I can lock the focus down here and then expose for this up here. So I can't imagine a scenario. That's why I don't use this much. But I have pressed the shutter button. All I've done is locked focus. I have not locked the exposure, because you can see the exposure is changing still, even though my focus is locked. So you have that option. Or I can just go up here, hit the AEL button, and then come down here and take the picture. So AEL button overrides all of the other, basically AEL will override the other AEL functions or the workflow, right? So if I lock auto exposure using the AEL button, it's not going to reacquire exposure when I fully press the shutter button in mode 2. And then there's mode 3, which is the opposite, right? This is back button focus mode, where I'm using the AEL button to acquire focus. So I can acquire focus down here. Oops, why am I not in mode 3? Let me I got to click OK. There, now we're in mode 3. So I can acquire focus down here and then acquire exposure up here, lock it, and take the picture. So I acquire focus down here. I'm going to hit the AEL button, which actually is now assigned to focus. I'm going to move my focus point up here, half press the exposure button to lock the exposure here, and then take a picture. I mean, you wouldn't normally do that. Usually back button focus is for doing birds in flight and other sports action type stuff, right? Okay, so that's how you do that. So hopefully that makes sense. Oh yeah, flying fish, I agree. DxOD Prime rocks. And let me scroll up and make sure I didn't miss anything there. That was that. Took a photo of my M5 at ISO 8000. Oh, okay. Yeah, amazed at the results. Yeah, DxOD Prime is awesome. And then Rick says, personally, I'd leave the focus and spot exposure in the exact center of the frame. I take both the spot exposure and the spot focus by moving the camera to the points I want before doing final framing. Take both spot exposure and focus. I'm moving the center to the points I want before doing final framing. Oh, I see. So Rick likes to, if I'm reading this right, he likes to spot meter using the center by looking around, then lock the exposure with the AEL button, and then do the framing that he wants. So it's just workflow, whatever works. I guess if you're hand holding the camera, that would work just fine, right? You don't have to commit to a certain framing before you get the exposure that you want. You can get the exposure you want, then commit to the framing after the fact. In my real estate photography, I always commit to the framing first, I get the framing right, and then I adjust for the lighting. Um, but I'm on a tripod, right? So I can do that. When you're hand holding, that's not as easy to do. But I get that. And he says it's quicker to use a center point like a rifle sight, capturing your light and focus points with AL and then half press the shutter button before the final framing. Yeah, exactly. It's the same idea, right? It's just a workflow. If you're hand holding, you can quickly measure the light, then frame properly. Um, but in my workflow, I'm on a tripod. So either way, you just have to kind of find what works best for you. But I think the way Rick's doing it for hand holding makes more sense than the way I showed you, which I'm on a tripod generally. But okay, that about sums it up for me in terms of highlight, spot, shadow metering. If there's no other questions, I can kind of wrap it up here. Hope everybody's doing well. I'll wait. I'll wait about 30 seconds for the chat messages to catch up with what I'm seeing versus what you guys are typing, in case any last minute questions come in. But I think it's episode 260. If you want to kind of like watch it in 18 minutes instead of 2 hours that it took me to do it here, you can watch episode 260. Just search for like spot metering or something on my channel. You'll find it that way too. But if you type in Rob Trek episode 260, it should come right up. Oh, thank you, Ben. Oh, I lost my classroom because of the this Delta thing, this variant that's come up. So I'm not going to be able to have access to that classroom. So I might have to just, I'm doing virtual classrooms now. And I was really building up some momentum too with the classrooms to the point to where I think, so it might be a while, Ben, before we can kind of collaborate on a in-person classroom teaching like I wanted to. I mean, we can always do the live thing and virtual, but in person is always best. Is well, in person is kind of on the back burner now. Yeah, that's true. Agree with Rick. Not many MFT users are stuck on tripods. Yeah, that's true. Because in my personal photography, like I said, I use spot metering about 10%, but in my professional work, I'm always on a tripod. For architectural things, right? I got to get my lines straight, and that's why my workflow is the way it is. But I'm glad Rick brought that up. The way he does it, that workflow I think makes more sense for handheld. Oh wow, okay, yeah, landscape users, yeah, definitely. Landscape users I would think would frame their image first, look at the histogram, spot meter. But like I said, you can't rely on the histogram, right? So always spot meter and work out your exposures. I mean, with landscapes, you can take all the time you want, generally speaking, right? So it's ideal for doing landscape photography, these techniques, landscape and architectural, where you don't have to be fast on your feet and do what like Rick is talking about, like birds in flight, animals in general, like my dog Ellie. I mean, I got some nice shots of her, but she doesn't sit still long. I just get lucky, you know. And exposing using spot metering the way Rick does, getting the spot meter correct first, then um, locking focus with the shutter makes more sense. And John says, I had an issue with my 75-1.8. I set the camera to flicker reduction 50 hertz. It would alter the aperture blades every time I point the camera. Oh, okay. Um, it is adjusting the aperture blades. I don't think because of the flicker reduction thing, right? what it's doing is basically your camera sensor can only receive so much light to be able to autofocus. So if the scene is too bright, it's not going to get enough contrast or detail to autofocus. Just like if the scene is too dark, you lose contrast, right? It's going to have trouble focusing in the dark, just like it will in very, very bright light. So it closes the aperture blades down to reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor so that it can still have the ability to autofocus. So you'll notice in very bright light, especially when things change from very bright to very dark, you'll hear the aperture blades open and closing to adjust so that the sensor gets just the right amount of light for the autofocus system to be able to work better. I believe that's what's happening. Not because of I don't think it has anything to do with the flicker reduction feature. I don't see how adjusting the aperture affects flicker reduction at all, other than yeah, I don't see it. So that's what it's doing actually, I believe. Yeah, that's what it's doing, Ben, right? You've noticed that the aperture blades kind of open and close while you're moving the camera. So, if you want to test that theory, I've done this. You can point the camera at the sun, or near the sun, I should say, and you'll see and if you look at the blade, you'll see them close down. And then when you point it back down to the ground, they'll open back up to let more light in to be able to focus. All right, everyone, I'm going to end it here. So thanks for joining me today. I know today was kind of wasn't much photo chat, mostly about how to use the camera. If you want me to do more live streams like this rather than our normal photo chat, just let me know in the comments. I can do both. This one was kind of long because I didn't prep enough, really, to be honest, for this stream. I just kind of talked about it with Rick yesterday via email, and I said, oh yeah, I can do that tomorrow. And lo and behold, it was a little sloppy, not as organized, but I think still very, very useful. And I should have my photo editing live stream this Thursday. I have to check my calendar this week, and I'll put it up tonight if I can. But I really appreciate everybody coming in today. As always, it's good to see everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. And I'll catch up with you guys, if not Thursday, next week on Tuesday. So thanks for being here with me today. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you again soon.